The pencil paused, then scraped again across the paper, as if the hand itself could not reconcile what the eyes had seen. June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. In a cramped private corner of a Pullman coach, Unoffizier Vera Burkhardt, a name he recorded furtively in a diary hidden beneath a bundle of clothing, tried to force words that would have meant solitary confinement had any of his superiors ever read them. The Americans must be lying. No country at war on two distant fronts could glow like this at 10 o'clock at night. He had only just stepped off the train, and already the sight contradicted 3 years of carefully drilled propaganda. Through the carriage window, the plane had looked like a scattering of stars brought down to earth. Houses, shop fronts, lamp posts, each window a pinprick of light. In the Reich, blackout orders had shuttered towns and villages since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification had reached only a small fraction of German farms. Here, electricity streamed freely, ordinary and unstoppable. One by one, nearly 1,850 men of the once feared Afrika Korps climbed down the polished steps, not packed into freight wagons or cattle trucks, but stepping from cushioned Pullman coaches with dining cars and sleeping berths. The entire town of Mexia had come out to see them arrive. They had come expecting humiliation, certainly, but nothing about this reception. The neatness, the polite distance, the abundant light fit the image the men had been fed for years. That evening would mark the start of a kind of cultural collapse, as devastating as any battlefield defeat. Nazi certainties being undermined not by bullets, but by the sheer spectacle of American industrial life. Victory, in the Allied imagination, was increasingly settled in figures and factories as much as in maneuvers and offensives. The military disaster that unspooled in North Africa in May 1943 began this arithmetic. On May 13, 1943, after a grinding campaign across deserts, General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered with roughly 275,000 German and Italian troops in Tunisia. Scattered units continued to lay down arms over the following days. But the decisive blow had been dealt. The elite desert formations that had once pushed the British back toward Egypt were now prisoners. Their journals, the personal papers scavenged later by historians, give an especially vivid picture of the psychological unraveling. Take Hedman Friedrich Radke, an Iron Cross first-class recipient hardened by fighting in France and North Africa, who began to comprehend a new reality the moment he landed at Oran. Thrust into makeshift camps with tens of thousands of others, men who had been trained to despise Allied logistics instead encountered a system whose order and scale they had not imagined. The Americans processed prisoners with a kind of bureaucratic precision that the Wehrmacht itself rarely matched at its best. Identity papers were photographed and filed. Medical inspections and inoculations were performed. Geneva Convention protections were explained in fluent German by officers specifically prepared for these duties. It was efficient, institutionalized kindness, an organized routine that, day by day, pried open a soldier's capacity to believe the caricature of the enemy he had been taught. Food proved the most immediate and disarming revelation. Oberjäger Hans Müller, taken from a panzer division, wrote to his mother 8 months later about Oran. In the camp, we were given food like nothing we'd seen in 6 months of desert operations. White bread, coffee that wasn't ersatz, meat served twice in a day. At first they thought it was a ploy, a demonstration designed to impress and deceive. Only later, as the same standards persisted, did they recognize these were not special treats, but the norm. The vessels that moved men and materiel across the ocean were themselves a lesson in mass production. The SS Robert E. Peary, famous for its astonishing construction time of 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at a California shipyard, was only an extreme example. Liberty ships were being turned out in astonishing numbers, with output that at peak reached multiple ships per day. Rather than return empty after delivering supplies, these convoys carried thousands of prisoners, sometimes as many as 30,000 new internees a month by the summer of 1943. Crossing the Atlantic, the Germans watched yet another dismantling of myth. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division detailed a scene that would recur: American crews casually disposing of food that would have been treasured by soldiers in the field. Half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread, jugs of milk left to spoil? There was no malice in the waste. To the crews, it was a byproduct of abundance. For the POWs, it was proof of limitless supply lines, of industrial output so vast that surplus seemed ordinary. The Liberty ships were also a catalogue of interdependence. By war's end, some 2,110 of them had been built, each requiring 250,000 individual parts made in dozens of states and assembled in yards that had been little more than fields only years before. Engines, turbines, even radar components, technologies Germans believed were rare or exclusive, appeared as standard equipment on vessels and in ports. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauborn, of an old Prussian family with generations of military service behind him, later recalled watching a radar antenna sweep above a ship's bridge and feeling a first. Private certainty. We have already lost. Arrival in the United States deepened that impression. On August 2, 1943, at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, prisoners saw piers and docks extending for miles, cranes working day and night, a tonnage throughput that dwarfed German ports like Hamburg. Norfolk sprawled over thousands of acres, a physical demonstration of scale that meant more to a soldier than any poster or sermon. A simple factory hand-turned worker, now a captive, counted dozens of cargo ships queued or being serviced. Machinery lifted loads that back home would have required teams of men and teams of horses. Coal smoke was replaced by electric motors. The air was cleaner and the movement smoother. From the port, the prisoners were marched onto trains bound inland. The landscape passed by in a procession of astonishment. In Germany, private cars remained the privilege of the few. The promised mass mobilization of the Volkswagen had produced only a tiny fraction of the vehicles once promised. Here, however, ordinary foremen and dock workers drove to work in their own cars and parked them in brightly lit lots. The rolling stock that transported prisoners north and west confused them most of all. Not 40-and-8 wagons or boxcars, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with reclining seats, dining cars with tableware, observation cars with wide windows. Hetman Radka later admitted they felt as if they were boarding a train for a vacation, not a convoy of defeated soldiers. Comfort only deepened the dissonance. A sergeant apologized one day that the air conditioning in their car was unreliable. A small courtesy that would have been unimaginable months earlier, and that undercut propaganda asserting American hardship. Over the 3-day trip from Norfolk to camps in Texas and Oklahoma, prisoners pressed against windows and watched a nation at work at all hours. Small towns like Martinsville and Danville shone with illuminated storefronts. Factories ran night shifts, their windows alight. Streets were lined with homes glowing in multiple rooms. Men who had been told America was a decadent, collapsing society now had to account for whole communities brimming with electricity and activity. Rail yards moved with a mechanical choreography the Wehrmacht's logistics couldn't match. In Roanoke, Virginia, Automated coal loaders and electric water pumps turned what would have been hours of manual labor in Germany into half an hour of mechanized efficiency. Guards and prisoners alike noticed the workers themselves: sturdy leather boots, steady hands, a comfortable indifference to small luxuries. Coca-Cola bottles were sipped and tossed into bins without a second thought. Cigarettes were stubbed out and discarded mid-smoke. Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Hamburg, estimated that a single yard's hourly electricity use exceeded that of his whole Berlin district in a day. It was not simply that Americans had more, it was that they treated abundance as ordinary. As the route moved westward through Tennessee and Kentucky, the scale ballooned. Rolling past the Alcoa aluminum works, prisoners glimpsed a plant stretching for miles along a river, its electric furnaces consuming power at a scale that dwarfed major German cities. Near Louisville, the trains slowed to let them stare at newly built synthetic rubber complexes. Rubber towns, sprawling plants that, in a remarkably short period, had sprung up to produce hundreds of thousands of tons of material vital to the war effort. Germany, despite its early scientific breakthroughs in chemistry, had been unable to match the mass throughput the United States could achieve. Then there was Willow Run outside Detroit, a single factory erected in months, where at peak a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the assembly line roughly every hour. Tens of thousands of workers, a complex web of subcontractors supplying over 1 million components, and an operation that consumed power and floor space on a scale most German officers could scarcely imagine. Luftwaffe pilots and ground crew, who had been told American aircraft were shoddily made, now watched assembly lines produce machines that were not merely serviceable, but produced in an astonishing rhythm. For many prisoners, the cumulative effect of these sights, the lighting of small towns, the casual waste of food, the passenger comforts, the towering factories and the rhythmic certainty of assembly lines, did something more subtle and irreversible than any single military loss. It rewired belief. The narrative of Nazi propaganda, which had relied on portraying the United States as decadent but weak, or as a society teetering under internal contradictions, could not survive the everyday evidence of material abundance and organizational competence laid out before these men. What had been a collapse on a Tunisian plain was becoming an intellectual collapse inside the minds of soldiers, not merely the surrender of arms, but the quiet surrender of conviction. The train thundered across the Mississippi just after dawn, its shadow gliding over the slow brown water below. As the prisoners leaned to the windows, silence fell. Beneath them, barges drifted along the current, each one piled high with golden grain. It was more food than most of them had seen in months, more, some realized with an ache of disbelief, than Germany had harvested in the whole of 1942. Through the smoke and sunrise, they could see the endless grain elevators along both banks, steel towers packed with enough wheat to feed entire cities. For men raised on the myth of German superiority, the view from the Eads Bridge in St. Louis was an education that no classroom or sermon could have delivered. Unreichia Karl Schmidt, the son of a Bavarian farmer, scrawled that morning into his pocket diary, "The Americans move food as we move ammunition, in endless quantities, careless of loss. I saw a single barge loaded with enough wheat to feed my village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." That scene repeated itself across the miles. At every junction, every depot, the prisoners saw a rhythm of motion. Trains hauling coal and steel, trucks filled with vegetables, farmers moving cattle as if they were counting grains of sand. When the convoy stopped in Kansas City, The smell of the great stockyards rolled through the open windows. Thousands upon thousands of animals, the constant sound of hooves and machinery, a visible river of meat being turned into food for a nation at war. The men who had survived on a few hundred grams of stringy meat a week in Africa now watched Americans eating beef sandwiches from lunch stands, talking, laughing, and smoking as if there were no war at all. Gefreiter Paul Fischer, once a believer in the discipline of German thrift, tried to make sense of it. "They eat meat as we eat bread," he wrote. "No, worse, they eat meat the way we wish we could eat bread." The guard bought us hamburgers, 20 of them, without thought, paying $1. Meat, cheese, vegetables, soft white bread. And this was not a special occasion. This was ordinary life. When the trains finally pulled into the camps scattered across Texas and Oklahoma, the captives found the final humbling blow waiting for them. Camp Hearn, Texas, a facility built in only 4 months, held several thousand men in conditions that, to most Germans, felt more like a comfortable barracks than a prison. There were wooden dormitories wired with electricity, heated with steam, fitted with flush toilets and hot showers. Every building seemed constructed with more timber than an entire village back home could have afforded. The camp's hospital astonished even the officers and doctors among the prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, once the chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, later admitted that the American infirmary exceeded the standards of most civilian hospitals in Germany. There were X-ray machines, surgical suites, and well-stocked pharmacies, and among the supplies, something few Germans had ever seen: penicillin. Bauer testified after the war. They used it freely, even for small infections among prisoners. "We had men dying in the field for want of basic sulfa drugs, and the Americans treated our scratches with their miracle medicine. They gave it without hesitation. Even the kitchens became classrooms in prosperity. Those assigned to food service found themselves using walk-in refrigerators, gas ranges, electric mixers, and dishwashers large enough to clean thousands of trays at once. The daily rations, milk, meat, eggs, and vegetables surpassed what German civilians had seen since before the invasion of Poland." Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, confessed in his journal, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not because it was spoiled, because regulations demand that 10% more be cooked than necessary. The rest is discarded. I cried as I threw good bread into the garbage." By September 1943, the United States faced an agricultural labor shortage. The war effort had drawn millions of men overseas, so the government authorized the use of German prisoners to fill the gap, on farms, in canneries, in lumber yards, and in small-town workshops. The policy, born of necessity, would do more to unravel Nazi ideology than any deliberate re-education program ever could. Every day, trucks carried groups of POWs through the American countryside, past miles of farmland, silos, and factories running 3 shifts around the clock. They were not blindfolded, not hidden away. They were permitted to see, and seeing changed everything. In Texas, Herbert Lang watched a cotton gin powered by the Colorado River Authority turn bales in a blur of motion. "A single machine did in an hour what our entire village could not do in a month," he recorded. The farmer was not nobility, not party elite, only a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. Even his workers, the colored ones, ate lunches with more food than a German worker saw in a week. Such revelations multiplied. In Nebraska, prisoners working in sugar beet fields watched combines sweep through acres of crops. machines replacing entire regiments of laborers. The fields stretched to the horizon, and each acre yielded twice what German land could produce. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, stationed near Scottsbluff, could not forget one conversation. The farmer's son, perhaps 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father owned. When I said so, he laughed. He said it wasn't even a good one. His father was waiting for a new John Deere. More astonishing still were the factories. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could not be used directly for war production, but they were employed in support industries, food processing, agriculture, transportation, where they glimpsed the inner machinery of America's industrial might. In New Jersey, at a Campbell soup plant, Germans stood in awe. Conveyor belts moved tomatoes faster than men could watch. Automatic fillers sealed hundreds of cans a minute. Steam cookers processed thousands more. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a small German food factory before the war, wrote in disbelief, "Everything was automated." One woman, gray-haired, managed a panel of controls that replaced 50 workers in Germany. She did this while drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Outside Detroit, others labored near the power plants feeding the automotive belt. Across the river, the massive River Rouge complex loomed. 100,000 workers, producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks with an energy appetite greater than that of the entire city of Hamburg. Oberjäger Franz Kellner described the surreal contrast. "We saw the parking lots, thousands of cars. The guard told us most belonged to the workers." Workers! In Germany, even our officers could not dream of such things. He said some had 2 cars, one for work and one for home. We thought he mocked us. By the winter of 1943, this steady exposure to America's wealth, technology, and democratic order had produced what U.S. intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome. Reports from the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office, a secret program devoted to re-educating. German POWs described a visible transformation. Major Paul Noland, one of the monitors, wrote that December, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown statistics. They have seen too much. Even the most loyal Nazis have gone silent. They still speak of Germany, but not of victory. They ask for newspapers, books, and courses. They are beginning to question what they once believed." Inside the camps, prisoner-run newspapers became the mirror of this shift. Der Ruf, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, began as a mouthpiece of nationalist pride and ended as a forum discussing democracy, economics, and the reconstruction of Europe. The American officers in charge encouraged this evolution, quietly providing reading materials and ensuring that anti-Nazi editors had freedom to publish. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that slipped through the censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, ruled by Jews, incapable of unity or strength. But I have seen the opposite. This is the most disciplined and organized country on earth. We were children told fairy tales by criminals." Then came the lesson none of them expected, the one that touched pride as much as ideology. After Italy's surrender in September 1943, Italian prisoners who agreed to work for the Allies were reorganized into Italian service units, paid wages, given lighter duties, and allowed freedoms no German could imagine. They labored beside Americans, ate in restaurants, even courted American women. Hedman Friedrich Schultz recorded bitterly, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them when they were our allies. They work freely, send money home, and are shown respect. The Americans do not hate them. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own. And then Christmas arrived. Across the United States, churches, charities, and civic groups adopted the idea that even enemy soldiers deserved compassion on the holiday. More than 500,000 Christmas packages were sent to German prisoners. Small boxes of candy, cigarettes, games, toiletries, or knitted scarves, all paid for and assembled by ordinary American citizens. At Camp Hearn, the local Methodist choir learned carols in German. Women from town baked cookies and cakes, while Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. The regulations forbade social contact beyond the fences, but the meaning was unmistakable. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died under Allied bombs in Hamburg, struggled to understand it. They know we are their enemies. Many have husbands, sons, or brothers fighting against us, yet they bring gifts. They sing for us in our language. It is not propaganda. It is genuine kindness. That moment, quiet and unrecorded by history books, carried a power that artillery never could. The men who stood behind the wire that Christmas night, hearing familiar hymns sung by foreign voices, knew that something fundamental had shifted. They had been raised to believe mercy was weakness, compassion a lie told by hypocrites. Now they saw it embodied in the people who had defeated them. Ordinary Americans whose abundance had not hardened them, whose power had not erased their humanity. The destruction of Nazi mythology was complete, not when the guns fell silent, but when these men realized that their enemy's greatest weapon was neither the B-24 nor the Liberty ship. It was the simple, unstoppable confidence of a nation that believed decency and strength could coexist. What kind of people, the prisoners wondered, would treat their enemies with such generosity? Only those completely certain of victory and utterly confident in their own strength. The Christmas feast itself seemed like something from another world. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. The sheer abundance of food was something Germany had not experienced since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they were sick, stunned that such quantities could be given to enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hans Auer. Better than German generals, better than party officials. And this wasn't special. The guards told us every American family ate this same meal for Christmas. He added, "If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat?" By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and the sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses, while professors from Stanford University gave lectures on democracy and economics. The hunger for knowledge was immense. Men who had grown up believing Americans were uneducated materialists discovered libraries with millions of books, universities open to all social classes, and research institutions that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing opposing viewpoints, a freedom unimaginable under Nazi censorship. Among them was Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist once attached to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. At Camp Shelby, he attended lectures on atomic physics and was astonished by the openness of his American instructors. American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred, he wrote later. They spoke of science as something universal, belonging to all mankind. They were years ahead of us, and they shared their knowledge even with enemies. Such generosity of spirit was beyond anything our ideology could explain. The camp theaters further expanded their understanding. Prisoners were shown not propaganda, but ordinary Hollywood films. They watched Gone with the Wind and saw a nation recover from defeat. They saw The Grapes of Wrath and were amazed that Americans would openly criticize their own society and even show such films to prisoners. They hide nothing, wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. They show their flaws, their failures, their struggles. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism meant death. Here it was considered patriotic. By spring 1944, prisoner labor programs expanded further. As American war production reached its height, German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing firsthand the unmatched scale of U.S. industry. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they watched as workers turned out 700 landing craft per month, each requiring some 20,000 parts. 20,000 workers, including thousands of women, operated cranes, welded steel hulls, and managed production lines with relentless efficiency. Women doing men's work, noted Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann. Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers handling drills. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet the production never stopped. 3 shifts, day and night, 7 days a week. They built more boats in 1 month than our entire Navy managed in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the daily production of 10,000 tons of steel. The blast furnaces never cooled, fed by endless trains hauling ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak, wrote Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann. I worked at Krupp before the war. I thought I understood industrial power. But here, they wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. Workers complained about overtime while creating what we couldn't achieve with slave labor. The harvest of summer 1944 delivered the final blow to Nazi myths about American weakness. Across the Midwest, prisoners worked side by side with American farmers and witnessed agricultural abundance on a staggering scale. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests where individual farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. The combines swept across the fields like ships through an ocean of gold, each harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in a year, wrote Unterscharführer Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia. One American farmer with machines does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photographs. Thousands of square miles of wheat. They could lose half the crop and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards stretching beyond sight. They saw perfectly good fruit discarded for small blemishes. Fruit that would have been prized in wartime Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to stabilize prices, a concept so shocking it caused emotional breakdowns among prisoners who had known hunger. They destroyed food to keep prices stable, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schulz. Mountains of oranges buried in pits because there were too many. We begged to send them to Germany, but the guards said it wasn't possible. The waste itself was proof of America's limitless resources. On June 6, 1944, news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, and with it, the final ideological collapse. The numbers alone shattered any remaining illusions. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw endless streams of ships, artificial harbors, and the massive logistical systems delivering 15,000 tons of supplies each day across open, Beaches. We knew then that everything was lost, wrote Oberfeldwebel Friedrich von Tauben. Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with myths and racial arrogance. We sent horses against trucks, rifles against automatic weapons, faith against reality. Yet, what most deeply transformed the prisoners was not American wealth. It was American humanity. Despite years of Nazi propaganda portraying Americans as decadent and weak, the POWs discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Müller received word that his son had died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany. Civilians in a nation still being bombed by American planes. They said they fought Hitler. Not Germans, wrote Feldwebel Otto Hermann. It sounded like propaganda, until we saw it was true. They wanted to rebuild Germany, not destroy it. Medical care especially impressed the prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning advanced techniques and using equipment far beyond anything available at home. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was offered freely. They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment, wrote Dr. Friedrich Bauer. Men suffering from mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. Their humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood, the calm confidence of real power. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had yielded extraordinary results. Over 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in democracy courses. Camp newspapers discussed constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated how to rebuild Germany after defeat. Fanatical Nazis began writing essays about democratic reform. Former officers drafted plans to modernize German agriculture using American methods. We became missionaries for democracy, admitted Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, in a 1975 interview. Not through propaganda, but observation. We saw freedom work. Ordinary Americans lived better than German nobles. We wanted that for our country. The transformation was so complete that American officials began to worry the enthusiasm had gone too far. Some prisoners even requested to stay in the United States after the war. A few married American women through pen pal programs, and thousands would eventually immigrate in the 1950s. April 1945 brought the final and most painful revelation. As Allied troops liberated concentration camps, the film footage was shown to German POWs. Many refused to believe it, insisting it was propaganda, until the letters and testimonies from home confirmed the truth. The moral collapse was overwhelming. Men who had endured military defeat with dignity now realized the regime they had served was not just defeated. It was monstrous. We thought we were warriors for a great cause, wrote Hauptmann Walter Schmidt. We learned we were instruments of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization. But we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak showed us what civilization truly means. When the war ended in May 1945, the German POWs faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers, and been treated with more respect by their enemies than by their own officers. In the final months of captivity, American authorities focused on preparing them for return to a devastated Germany. They provided vocational training, agricultural courses, and civic education. Prisoners learned about what would soon be called the Marshall Plan. the American initiative to rebuild Europe, not punish it. They prepared us to rebuild, not to hate, wrote von Tauben. They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, ruined, and hungry, but carrying something priceless: a vision of what a free and prosperous society could be. These former prisoners, once indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, became quiet agents of change in post-war Germany. They had seen democracy, efficiency, equality, and mercy. And they brought that knowledge home. They had witnessed not just American power, but the moral strength behind it. They knew that rebuilding was possible, because they had seen it firsthand. Many of the German prisoners of war who had been held in the United States later became influential figures in West Germany's post-war recovery. Hans Kroll, once detained at Camp Shelby, would go on to serve as West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who lectured fellow prisoners at Camp Koch, rose to become the first president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Marschall, held at Camp Herne, later represented Germany at the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, who spent his captivity at Fort Robinson, played a central role in reforming Germany's post-war agricultural system. These men, and many others, carried back with them more than memories. They brought new ideas about efficiency, fairness, and freedom. They applied American industrial principles to German manufacturing, introduced modern agricultural methods, and infused democratic ideals into a society that had once been steeped in authoritarianism. The West German economic miracle of the 1950s was not born in isolation. It drew, in part, on lessons learned behind barbed wire in American prison camps. We discovered that real prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest, wrote Hans Kroll in his memoirs. We saw that democracy builds wealth, that diversity strengthens nations, and that treating workers with dignity increases productivity. These lessons reshaped the mindset of thousands. Historians often describe the German POW experience in America as one of the most successful re-education efforts in modern history, not because it relied on propaganda, but because it didn't. Instead, it worked through exposure and observation. Prisoners saw a functioning democracy that was confident yet compassionate. They watched factories run with precision, farms flourish through cooperation, and communities thrive in freedom. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading historian of the German POW experience, summarized it best. America won the ideological war not with slogans, but with reality itself. Every meal served, every light switch that worked, every flush of a toilet was silent testimony against Nazi ideology. The prisoners, many raised in a world of scarcity and propaganda, were converted not by lectures, but by prosperity. Statistics reflect the success of this quiet transformation. Out of 371,683 German prisoners held in the U.S., fewer than 1% ever tried to escape, just over 2,200 attempts in total. And of those, none succeeded in evading capture permanently. After the war, surveys found that 95% of former prisoners rated their treatment in the United States as good or excellent. Even more telling was the lasting emotional bond many formed with Americans. Decades later, thousands continued writing letters to the families who had shown them kindness. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, more than 500 former German POWs returned to Austin, Texas, for a reunion. They brought wives, children, and grandchildren to show them where their transformation had begun. At that event, former officer Hans Vea, once held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later a physician in Maine, spoke movingly about his experience. Life in the camps was better than the lives many of us had known back home. We had running water, warm rooms, and enough to eat. But what mattered most was dignity. We were treated as men, not as enemies. Another former prisoner, Staff Sergeant Kurt Meyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as foes, but as young men far from home. They shared their food, their stories, sometimes even their homes. Their humanity changed us forever." The highlight of that reunion came when Hermann Gutz, once a Nazi officer and by then 78 years old, delivered a powerful keynote speech. His words captured the entire experience. "We came to America as enemies, Nazis, believers in a terrible lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that true strength is not found in conquest, but in creation, not in hatred, but in diversity, not in tyranny, but in freedom. We saw the arsenal of democracy at full power. We saw farmers who fed the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated their enemies with dignity." He concluded, "We returned to Germany determined to build, not destroy, to create a nation that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ruins was built upon lessons learned in American prison camps. We arrived as conquerors, but we left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, we thank you for showing us the way." The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans, once divided by hatred, stood together, united in a recognition of what humanity and humility can achieve. The scale of the POW experience was astonishing. The U.S. government established over 500 camps across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. Of these, 175 were main camps, each supporting several branch facilities. Some held only a few hundred prisoners, others housed up to 12,000. Most were constructed within just 90 days. At its peak in May 1945, the United States held over 370,000 German prisoners, part of a total Axis POW population of about 425,000. The camps processed tens of thousands of new arrivals every month, 20,000 monthly in 1943, 30,000 after D-Day, and as many as 60,000 in the war's closing months. These men provided a vital labor force during wartime shortages. They contributed more than 14 million man-days of agricultural labor and processed 100 million board feet of lumber. Their work added an estimated $230 million in value to the U.S. economy, a remarkable figure for the 1940s. They earned about 80 cents a day, most of which was credited to their accounts, used for camp canteen purchases, or saved until repatriation. Education and reform were central to camp life. More than 40,000 POWs participated in educational programs, and over 30,000 took English classes. Another 15,000 pursued vocational training, while 8,000 enrolled in university correspondence courses. The prisoners even produced 135 different camp newspapers, where they practiced free expression for the first time. When the war ended, the legacy of these experiences endured. Around 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the United States permanently, and over 12,000 maintained lifelong friendships with American families. Surveys revealed that 74% said captivity had changed their worldview positively. and 61% expressed a deep interest in democratic governance. By 1945, fewer than 1 in 10 still held strong Nazi sympathies. For many, captivity had become a kind of education. They had entered as soldiers and left as students of democracy. Their defeat, paradoxically, had become a kind of liberation from tyranny, from propaganda, from ignorance. America's greatest victory, some historians argue, was not won on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where simple exposure to a functioning democracy accomplished what armies alone could not: the transformation of enemy minds. When the prisoners arrived, they believed in Germany's superiority and America's weakness. By the time they boarded ships home in 1946, they understood how wrong they had been. They had seen a society of abundance, powered not by conquest, but by creativity. The same trains that brought them into captivity had carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them carried the architects of a democratic future. Their experience revealed a profound truth. America's most powerful weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but the visible success of its free society. The prisoners had been awed by American industry, but it was the moral and economic strength behind it that truly converted them. This transformation planted the seeds for Europe's post-war recovery and the ultimate defeat of the Nazi dream. These men returned to Germany as witnesses, proof that democracy and prosperity could coexist. The economic revival that followed in the 1950s, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, owed much to these lessons of freedom, equality, and productivity. They had expected to find a divided, decadent America. Instead, they encountered an industrious, confident nation built on liberty and cooperation. They came as captives but left as believers in democracy. In their admiration for American abundance lay the earliest stirrings of the transatlantic partnership that would later define the modern world: the NATO alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the shared commitment to peace and progress. When 850 veterans of the Africa Corps stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, in 1943, they had no idea they were about to undergo one of the most profound ideological transformations in modern history. What they saw in America shattered everything they had been taught to believe. The story of the German prisoners of war in America is, ultimately, a story of redemption through revelation. It demonstrates that the greatest victories are sometimes achieved not by destruction, but by demonstration, not through fear, but through freedom. The German soldiers who once fought for tyranny became, in time, unexpected ambassadors of democracy. They carried home the lessons of humanity, productivity, and liberty, and helped rebuild a nation from ashes into one of the world's most stable democracies. Their journey, from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens, remains one of history's most extraordinary transformations. It was achieved not through coercion, but through the quiet, undeniable power of example. America's secret weapon was not just its industrial strength, but its moral strength. The ability to turn enemies into allies through decency, opportunity, and truth. In the end, that transformation was America's greatest victory. The German prisoners were awed by America's might, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better, freer world.